In this lecture, we are going to be looking at examples of art that was produced under the Byzantine period. And the Byzantine period is the period that comes after Rome, more particularly early Christian Rome, and its beginning is marked by the fall of Rome, although some people do argue this point. Now here's the situation, okay? Prior to the fall of Rome, Rome has become so big that the emperor cannot effectively manage from his place in Rome. So here's the original capital of the Roman Empire. And so what Constantine decides to do is he decides to create a second capital. And this capital is located in the eastern region of Rome. And this capital is Constantinople. And it's named after himself, Constantine, and it was built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, which is why this is called the Byzantine period. So Constantinople becomes the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. So Rome falls. With the looking at the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine period, what we're looking at is we're looking at art that's produced in what was formerly the eastern part of Rome. We look at art produced in the former eastern region and the former western region separately because it's very, very, very different, as we're going to come to see. So, eastern region, okay? So, we have, in 527 CE, Justinian I that becomes the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Okay? And what's interesting about this is at the outset, the empire is at its height. Usually what we see is as an empire develops, it becomes stronger and more wealthier, it reaches its height, and then it is in decline. What's unique about the Byzantine period is that, or the Byzantine Empire, is that it starts out at its height. So you can kind of almost argue that the entire history of the empire is marked by decline since it starts out at its height. And you can see from the pink areas here, and even the orange areas that are added to the territory, that this actually is a very expansive and very large and very powerful empire. Now, just to let you know, we do have the Byzantine period demarcated by early, middle, and late. You do not have to know that for your exam. All you need to know is that the art is affiliated with the Byzantine period. In the Byzantine Empire, Christianity was the only lawful religion, and so we definitely are going to see a very strong mixture of church and state. The emperors considered themselves the earthly representatives of Jesus himself, where their will was God's will. So we have this very traditional approach of using religion to solidify political power. And what we're looking at here as we're looking at the Hagia Sophia, which is considered to be the architectural triumph of the Byzantine Empire. Many people think that this is one of the architectural triumphs in all of the history of architectural triumphs, of course under the Pantheon, which is the most important structure ever built. Now, speaking of this, let's take a look at the Hagia Sophia. We can see that it's a round structure, it's a rotunda, and at the entrance, which is hidden in this view, we do see that it's emphasized. We can see this part up here that is emphasized. And then it's topped by a dome. Rotunda, emphasized entryway topped by a dome. What does this sound like? I think it sounds like the Pantheon, and it does. This was a structure that was influenced by the Pantheon. In scale, the Hagia Sophia rivals the size of the Pantheon, which means that it's roughly about the same size. But what's unique here in this image, and this is certainly not something that we saw in the Pantheon, is we see that there are these four sort of pencil-like looking towers that surround the Hagia Sophia. And these towers are called minarets. These towers are unique to the Islamic religion. These are Islamic structures. So this might sound kind of strange because we're talking about the Byzantine period. We're talking about a time and an empire that is strictly Christian. It's the only lawful religion. So why is it that we are seeing Islamic architectural forms? And the answer to this is not part of the original structure. The minarets were added in 1453 when the Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire, overtook this region and made the Hagia Sophia a mosque, which is like a church. So the minaret has a couple of functions. Okay, one, the minaret is intended to mark the presence of Islam in a city, to let people know that there are people in the city that practice this religion. Two, they are also used to call the faithful to prayer. Now this is done in two different ways. Okay, one, this is done visually. We can see that these are very tall towers, so they are easily seen throughout the city. You see the tower, it reminds you to pray. But the minaret also can call people to prayer through sound, where they would have people that would sing these songs, and through megaphones, or in the past just through the carrying of the voice, these songs would call people to pray, let them know it's time to pray. In the Islamic belief system, there are 5 pillars of Islam, 5 things that are kind of the foundation of the religion, and one of them is prayer, and that one should be praying 5 times a day around the clock. So the minaret calls one to prayer. Let's take a look at the interior, which is equally as amazing. So here we have the interior of the Hagia Sophia. And what's unique about the Hagia Sophia's interior is that it is a central plan structure, but the very, very center part is like a square. These walls that you see on either side actually make this kind of square central area, or maybe, yeah, it's more like a square. And then on the side here, which we can't see in the photograph, there's more areas of the church. Now this kind of creates for an interesting situation because we have this square space, but it's topped by a round dome. How do we make this transition visually as well as spatially from square to circle? The Byzantine architects invent a solution to this, which is called the pendentive. The pendentive was invented in the Byzantine period, and it is a substantial contribution that they make to architecture. You can see in the drawing here. It's based on the principle of the arch. The arch comes down to a point. Each point rests, as you can see here, on one of the 4 parts of the square. Then it angles up, as an arch does, and that's what creates the circular space on which the dome sits. So you can see a pendentive here. Here's another pendentive here. So that's what allows for that transition from square to circle. So upon this pendentive sits this incredible dome. And you can see that the dome is lined with windows. There's 40 of them to be exact. This idea of lining the base of the dome with windows, this is a Byzantine feature, something that originates during this time period. The idea is that by having these windows line the base of the dome, that it appears as though the dome sits on light and air, which is a really incredible thing to think about and to behold. Now, on a conceptual standpoint, this makes sense, because traditionally the dome is considered to be kind of holding in the space of the heavens. So it's this idea that because it sits on light and air, that light, that air, that's heaven itself. Now, something else really incredible happens. When the light shines in, it hits this area in here, which, as you can see, is covered in gold. Gold paint, gold mosaics. The light hits the gold and then streams down to the people below, and it makes it appear as though golden rays of light are coming down from the heavens. And that is something that appears very mystical. It's very incredible. It's very beautiful. And it's intended to enhance the spirituality and the experience of being inside of the church. this is something I'd like for you to think about as we move forward, and we're going to look at more and more church architecture, where the architecture is not only functional, and it's not only meant to communicate symbolic ideas, but there is an idea or a thought that's put into the experience, how people feel when they're inside, as a way to really sort of solidify this impressionable, memorable religious experience. All right, another incredible structure that was built by the Byzantines. This is San Vitale. San Vitale is located in Italy, in the city of Ravenna. Now, San Vitale is a central plan structure, rotunda, topped by a dome, with an emphasized entryway. What does that sound like? If you're thinking it sounds like the Pantheon, you are correct. It is like the Pantheon, but it's not an exact replication of the Pantheon. This actually is a much more complex floor plan consisting of intersecting ovals and octagons that creates this kind of faceted or sort of angled appearance of the exterior, which is actually really dynamic. As you walk around the structure, the appearance kind of shifts and changes because of these angles and the way the angles change as you move around the structure. Very, very interesting, very incredible. Now, with this San Vitale, we can see that it's very plain on the exterior. On the inside, though, it's super amazing, super fancy, containing some of the most incredible mosaics that were made during the Byzantine period. This is highly typical of early Christian and Byzantine architecture. Plain on the outside, super amazing and fancy on the inside. I make this point because we are going to be looking at Islamic architecture, and you're going to see that Islamic architecture is going to be very different. And so this is a really great kind of point of contrast between Islamic and early Christian architecture. Let's take a look at the interior. Look how gorgeous this mosaic is. One of the things that's really incredible and really beautiful about Byzantine art is they use a lot of gold and they use a lot of very rich, deep colors. And when you put the two together, it is quite a treat to look at visually. So, so beautiful. And imagine this covering the entire surface area of the interior. Really amazing things to be looking at. So we're looking at the Mosaic of Christ between two angels, which is located in the apse of San Vitale. We know that the apse is the most important place in the interior of the church. This is the place where the altar sits, from which the religious rituals are conducted. This is the focal point of the church, where everybody sits and angles towards the apse to observe these rituals. So it's going to make sense that in the most important place in the interior that we're going to see this representation of Jesus. Now do note that in this representation of Jesus that we do see him as young and unbearded. Okay? We know that this is the original way that Jesus appears in art. This idea of Jesus as bearded is not going to appear until the Middle Byzantine period. So at the outset, Jesus is still young and unbearded. Jesus sits in the very center. That alone gives him a sense of compositional importance that he sits in the very center. You could maybe argue there's a little hierarchical scale going on here, because he is seated and he's the same size as people standing. Kind of the same kind of hierarchical scale that we saw with the interaction between the sun god Shamash and King Hammurabi, and that was in the Babylonian period of Mesopotamia. So same kind of interaction, hierarchical scale, to again show a level of importance. What else is showing that Jesus is important? How about the fact that he's wearing purple? So purple is a color of royalty, so that's meant to indicate kingship. Look what he's holding. A rod and a ring. Does that sound familiar? Those were the symbols of power that Hammurabi was holding, or was being handed to by Shamash, the stele of Hammurabi. Very old, traditional symbols of power. And then finally, a halo. Now the halo is meant to symbolize being sacred or being divine in the Christian religion, but Jesus' halo is bedazzled, so it kind of looks like a crown, and that is also indicating power. So we have all of these very visual representations of kingly earthly power, which is something that people could understand. So they understand Jesus in these terms of power. He's standing by these two angels, and these angels are just kind of whatever. They're just standing there. They're like Jesus's support staff, helping him out as he rules over the world. And here we have the world he's sitting on as his throne. This is Saint Vitalis, who was the saint after which San Vitale was founded and named for. And then this is the bishop that oversaw the initial construction of San Vitale, the commencement of its building. And here he's holding a model right in here. Okay, now let's keep this in mind and let's take a look at another mosaic. So here's the mosaic we just looked at. And I put this photograph of the entire San Vitale Apse in here so that you can see the placement of the mosaic. Here it is right here. Now here we're looking at the court of Justinian. And in this apse, it's located right here. So Justinian, as we know, is the first emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And we have him in this image here. And this is a very fascinating mosaic for a couple of reasons. Take a look at the court of Justinian and take a look at the Mosaic of Christ. I'd like for you to please pause this recording and take a minute to try to note visual or conceptual similarities that you might see between these two. So now that you've noted your similarities, let's take a look at this. Okay. First of all, let's take a look at placement, right? Both are placed in the center of the composition. Now it's kind of hard to tell, but the clothing, okay? Justinian as well is wearing purple. So that is our representation of kingship or royalty. He's wearing a crown and he has a halo. He's the only one that has these in this grouping of people. Coincidence or no, Justinian is surrounded by his entourage that happens to number 12. Does that number sound familiar to you? That would be the number of Jesus's apostles. The point here is that Justinian is trying to link himself with Jesus visually and conceptually. So that when people see the Jesus mosaic, they see the Justinian mosaic, they make that connection. And again, this is that tried and true strategy of showing political and religious power together. Because, as you know, there's no separation of church and state in the Byzantine period. And the laws of the church were considered to be the laws of the state. So Justinian's kind of trying to say that he's sort of acting on behalf of Jesus. All the things that he does is on behalf of Jesus. And how can you argue that? How could you question the authority of this individual when he's pretty much Jesus' earthly representative? Now, there's something about the placement that further supports this idea. This is to our left, but if you're looking at it from Jesus' standpoint, this is to Jesus' right. This is a place of privilege. Have you ever heard that saying, right-hand man? Someone's like helper, like wingman or whatever. It's kind of like that idea, that Justinian is Jesus's right-hand man. And that also is meant to give him a sense of power. Now, just to further explain what we're seeing here, we do have groupings of 3. Okay, this is Justinian and his helpers, the people that administer the government. This is the clergy, the highest ranking clergy, who was the bishop of San Vitale at the time. And then this is the imperial guard. And this was meant to be a representation of the Byzantine power structure as a whole. The military, the government, and then the church. There is some hierarchy that's going on here as well that's being shown through the placement of the feet. If you look at the feet, you look at the fact that the feet are all looking like they're stepping on one another. The feet who come out the farthest are the feet of the person more powerful. And then we have Justinian, who's wearing the most fabulous shoes out of everybody here. And that's meant to show that not only is he stepping on the foot, he has the best shoes, he has the most hierarchy. You can also argue for hierarchy with the crown, these like nice little earring things he's wearing, or else they're like hanging parts from the crown. He's got this gorgeous brooch on. He's got this little like tassel deal. He's got this gold cloth. He has a lot more accessories, which indicate wealth, which in turn indicate power. Now there's another mosaic. If I can go back for 1 minute, this mosaic is right here across from the Justinian mosaic, and this is Theodora and attendants. Theodora was Justinian's wife. So we have her here as an expression of power, but there's a lot of careful thought put into this to make sure that that expression of power is not to the equal of her husband. Now there is power because, and this is actually very rare, she is in this official image on her own. We do see representations of power in that she too wears the purple. She too has the halo. She too has the crown. So she is the most adorned out of everybody. She also has relatively a central placement within the composition. So these are indications of power. Now, how is this an indication not so much of power then? Okay, well, this curtain indicates interior space. The fountain indicates exterior space. She's actually waiting outside, and this is a representation of a little bit of a lower hierarchy. Together, the Justinian and Theodora mosaics are meant to be showing that they are having a procession. They're both holding bowls, which are offerings. They were going to proceed towards the altar and give offerings to God and Jesus and saints and whoever. As the procession is ready to begin, Justinian and his entourage wait in the inside. Because Theodora is of slightly lesser status, she is waiting on the outside. So the other thing that indicates a little bit of a lesser hierarchy is that she's placed to the left. Her Justinian's mosaic is to the right, the more privileged position as being right-hand man, and then to the left is Theodora, a little bit of a lesser privileged position. Now, the presence of Theodora is significant. I don't want to undermine that in a lot of really interesting ways. Theodora and Justinian actually never went to Ravenna. These images of a procession, or waiting for a procession to begin, they are fictional. Now, it would make sense that even though they were never there, that we would still see images of Justinian in the church because he was the Byzantine emperor. But it would not really make sense to see Theodora. And that's what's really interesting. It indicates that as a queen, that she actually did have a lot of power. And what's even more interesting about this is her biography. So traditionally what happens is, if you're an emperor, you marry someone to make a political match or an economic match. He married Theodora because he loved her. And that was practically unheard of at the time. And what was even more unheard of was that she was not a princess or a high-ranking noble woman, but she actually was an actress and a prostitute. And so he fell in love with her, he married her, and she turned out to be very, very wise politically. He relied a lot on her guidance to help run the empire. And we get this strong role that she played with her presence in the San Vitale. Okay, so a common form of art that we see produced during the Byzantine Empire is the icon. Icons were paintings on panel, and they were used in the church so that people could look at the icon and they could contemplate and they could think about God. Now, there is a very specific style to Byzantine icon imagery, and I'm going to actually tell you the features of this style in the next slide because it has all of the common features that we come to expect in icons from the Byzantine period. Now, the history of the icon is one that is very tenuous, or was very tenuous, because what we do see is a moment in time known as iconoclasm. And what happened was a very conservative group of the church leadership decided that looking at icons was akin to worshiping false idols. And so what happens is they decree that no more icons could be made and that any existing icons had to be destroyed. So it's very hard for us to study early Byzantine period icons because so many of them were destroyed during this period of iconoclasm. This period was a short-lived period. I've read differing accounts on the dates. It looks to be between somewhere in 40 and 80 years that this happened. After iconoclasm ends and a more moderate group of church leadership comes back into power, immediately we see the return to producing icons. Now, in terms of icons, there are a couple of things that are common that I will show you here because they're present in this image. One is throne or seat of wisdom. This is a very common Christian religious image that we see in Byzantine art. This begins in Byzantine art. And basically it involves little baby Jesus sitting on the lap of Mary, whereas Mary, his mother, acts as the throne or the seat upon which Jesus sits. Throne or seat of wisdom. The other common feature that we see is the homunculus. And the best way to describe homunculus is man baby. You can see that Jesus looks like a little man, kind of wrinkly. He certainly has a receding hairline. Man baby. The homunculus is very, very common in Christian art, at least through the Renaissance. And it originates in the Byzantine period, both the throne of wisdom and homunculus. Now, I want to make something, though, very clear. The throne or seat of wisdom, in the context of Christian art originates in the Byzantine period. But this notion of a baby God sitting on his mother's lap, that actually has origins all the way back to ancient Egypt. So this is yet another example of appropriating a sort of pagan or polytheistic religious image and recontextualizing it to a Christian one. This is a much better work of art to look at to get an idea of the common features of the Byzantine icon, which is something that absolutely is going to be on your final exam. One common feature that we see is that we have a plain composition, meaning that it's a plain background. And this background will usually be gold. Heavy use of gold is a common feature of the Byzantine period. In architecture, in mosaics, in icons and everything, heavy use of gold. Now the plain background is coupled with a simple composition overall. One, maybe two individuals. The plain background and simple composition is so that you will focus on the religious figure. Your eye won't be wandering and you won't be distracted by trees and other things like that. The point of these, as I said, is focus and contemplation. So they don't want you distracted by other things. Now the gold background is significant for a couple of reasons. Okay? One, when we think of gold, we think of wealth. Now, it's not really appropriate for us to be thinking about material wealth. We're looking at a religious image. And a religious image isn't going to really encourage people to go out to get rich, to amass as much material wealth as possible. So in this context, that gold is a spiritual wealth. So the gold is an indication of spiritual wealth. The gold background also is a way to locate this figure, in this example Christ, in an abstract spiritual space. So he's not like here on earth, he's not standing in a garden, he's not standing in a city, but he's in this like otherworldly place, the heavens, the cosmos, whatever. Also typical is a lack of emotion. For the most part, there's a little emotion here, which I'll talk about in a minute, but for the most part, it's pretty restrained. It's not like the Hellenistic period where people are gesturing and crying and things like that. We're seeing that the images are rather abstract. There's not a sense of realism, especially with like the stylized treatment of neck wrinkles. Elongated form, and that's seen especially in the treatment of the nose and the fingers. Figures are represented stiff, and they're represented frontal. And then finally, you'll notice that Jesus now has his beard. The beard originates in the Middle Byzantine period, and with that we have the second approach to representing Jesus in art, and it's what I call bearded, grumpy Jesus. He does look kind of grumpy, and this is actually pretty consistent. Grumpy Jesus stays with us all the way through to the Gothic period. The idea behind grumpy Jesus is that he's meant to kind of want to encourage people to follow the rules, do what the religion says, or else you're in big trouble. I would like to finish just talking briefly about crucifixion images. The image of the crucifixion was not something that immediately appeared in Christian art. It's not until the middle of the 5th century that we see the first crucifixion appearing in art. I believe it's because at first people felt that the crucifixion, this idea of someone being publicly tortured and then brutally murdered, was something that was too difficult and maybe perhaps too disrespectful to show in art. But eventually it was recognized that this was a very powerful moment and a very powerful symbol for the history of the religion. And so we start to see it being incorporated in. Now what's important is these earliest representations. This is believed to be the first representation of the crucifixion in art. You'll notice that with the depiction of Jesus that we do still have some classical influence. Can you see the classical influence in this work of art? If you identified the contrapposto stance, you would be correct. If you identified the musculature of Jesus, you would also be correct. It's a little bit of classical features, which we actually know is very common for early Christian Rome, to see those classical features, which, by the way, they do go away in the Byzantine period. We really, aside from maybe a contrapposto stance, we're not seeing too much classicism. Now, in these earliest images, Jesus is shown as this kind of otherworldly spiritual being in the sense that, okay, first of all, he's unbearded, he's young. That's typical of early Christian Rome. I just wanted to point that out really quick. He's otherworldly in the sense that he just kind of floats on the cross. He kind of looks like he's sleeping. We don't see a sense of pain. At this time, the humanity of Jesus isn't really emphasized. However, by the time we get to the middle of the Byzantine period, we do start to see that the humanity of Jesus does begin to be emphasized, and the physical pain that he feels being crucified is something that's recorded in art. So there's two types of crucifixion images. These kind of like sleeping, floating Jesuses, and then these pained Jesuses. He's got his beard, typical now of the Byzantine period and beyond. We see blood. But we also see the effect of gravity on his body as his body kind of hangs, and that idea of the painful physical feelings you would get if your body was hanging in this manner. We do see some sadness on the part of the attendants here, where we have it's sad, but not quite as much as we're seeing here. Heavy use of gold, which is typical of the Byzantine period, to create these plain backgrounds to focus our attention, as well as to convey spiritual wealth and a location in an abstract spiritual space. And this concludes our lecture on the Byzantine period.